Good to be with you today. The way the room is inhabited reminds me of a sign that I once saw outside a little Methodist church in Louisiana. Preacher obviously knowing his congregation because it said, "Come early to get a pew in the back." I'm also reminded of an early experience with outcomes assessment at the Dallas Morning News. It's probably still this way, but on Friday nights during football season, it's kind of all hands on deck to do rewrites on the high school football games. And when you check in for that particular duty, you get a list of the games and an indication of how much space each one is to be given. So if it's, Plano versus Richardson, it might be 6 paragraphs plus stats. If it's a less important game, it would be, 3 paragraphs, no stats. So at any rate, we would sit there through the course of the evening and take the reports from the reporters in the field and write them, and they would be, we would make the deadline of midnight, and they would be in the paper the next morning. One evening, unusually so, the sports editor called us together at the end of that shift and said that he just wanted to tell us how much he appreciated the work we were doing and wanted to single out in particular a story that had been written that evening by one of the staff reporters, not me, but one of the staff reporters. And he said, "I just want to commend the writer because in 4 paragraphs the writer has given us a sense of the moment, a sense of the occasion, a sense of place. We know what the weather was like. We know what the band's uniforms looked like, the cheerleaders. And there is just this wonderful kind of color to the piece. In fact, there are really only a couple of questions a reader might ask after reading this story. Which expletive-deleted team won the expletive-deleted game? And what was the expletive-deleted score?" So a little experience in outcomes assessment in the early going. One of my co-speakers was looking at the program today, and she said, "Are you really going to talk for 90 minutes?" And I said, no, we're all going to be talking for 90 minutes, and I hope that that will be the case. I hope that at any moment you'll be willing to use one of these microphones and raise a question or challenge something that I've said or express a reservation. There are a few specific opportunities in the presentation that invite you to take a particular role in the discussion, and I hope particularly that you'll respond to those. It is good to be with you, and this was the topic that I was asked to talk about, and I will talk about this topic, but as I looked at this week after week after week and looked at your program, I decided I didn't like it. What I really liked a lot more was the theme of your conference, moving from proving to improving, because that is really the point of accreditation, that is the point of assessment, that is the point of all that we do. It isn't just about being accountable, it is about enabling our programs and our institutions to become stronger. Otherwise, really what would be the point? So moving from proving to improving. Just to begin with getting a sense of the room and some sense of the challenge that we all share, I'd be happy to hear the best or worst excuse you've ever heard for these points. And I'm not going to read the PowerPoint slides to you because unless you tell me otherwise, I'm assuming everyone in the room can read and write. And so I always find it kind of irritating when people project a a lengthy slide in PowerPoint and then proceed to read it to me word for word. So I'm not going to do that. But you probably hear these excuses from time to time, and share a couple of those with us, if you would. You can't measure that, right. And then the variation on that theme is, it may take my students years to appreciate what I'm teaching them today. That's a good one. What are some others? Yes?
I just do it holistically.
I do it holistically, right. My long years of experience. What else? Okay, yes. We'll just wait them out, right. The faculty are here year after year, and yes. Any others? Please.
So, do you think that we actually teach these outcomes?
Do you think that we, ooh. Right.
How about the syllabus is already too long?
Syllabus is already too long. How about the excuse that really good courses kind of have to evolve? You know, you can't begin with the straitjacket of outcomes. So, at any rate, a number of us have heard some interesting excuses. There are probably new ones being invented every day, but the one that I've heard most often is, well, of course I do assessment. I give grades, don't I? And, you know, there are some interesting answers to that. One of the reasons I enjoy talking about the DQP to people who are engaged in assessment, and I'll be doing so again in about 2 weeks at the Indiana University Conference on Assessment, is that I see a lot of shared values between the work that is being done to craft a consensus in terms of learning outcomes and the work that you do in assessment. I think there's a close alignment between the two, and I think that there are potential synergies, and it may be this third category that we should be giving most of our attention to, because I think there lies the opportunity to do both of our jobs maybe even more effectively than we're already doing them. So alignment of values, as you see in the left column, there are some kind of bedrock assumptions that guide us in the work we do in assessment. We ask our faculty members to be intentional, as intentional in their framing of outcomes as they would be if they were writing a scholarly paper. I mean, after all, imagine a member of your faculty sending an article to a journal saying, you know, at no point in this article are my objectives clearly delineated. That would be absurd, and yet you do hear faculty members talking about the straitjacket of outcomes and courses evolving. So one of the things we do is we ask our academic leaders, our faculty members, to be intentional about what goes on in the classroom. We ask our colleagues to engage with us in measuring performance so that they can become stronger, we can become more effective, so that we can assure ourselves that the teaching we're doing is translating into learning. And then we understand that people make comparisons and they need good information to do so. And part of the job we do is to enable that kind of comparison to be made. So in the right column then you see the ways in which the expectations of DQP and tuning, and if you need a little DQP tuning 101, that's coming up in just a minute. But this is just to clarify that what you're doing and what we're doing at Lumina Foundation has a lot in common DQP was never intended to be particularly innovative, particularly original, particularly inventive. It attempts to draw on what is generally known and understood to be the outcomes of an associate degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and to express that consensus in ways that people can find useful. One of the rules for us in terms of developing these statements, these outcome statements, was to do so in a way that not only allows assessment, but in fact invites assessment, so that the outcomes are really couched in terms of student performance, what students do to demonstrate the learning that they've accomplished. And then when it works, institutions and programs working with these outcomes and with assessment can point to their areas of accomplishment, their areas of strength. So, because learning outcomes are important, I thought we might begin this morning by just quickly rehearsing some learning outcomes for this hour that we have to spend together. And one of those will be to remind some of you and to inform others of you why these projects, these processes in the first place. What were the kind of the conditions that brought them about? And how are they related? Because that relationship is in fact shifting. It is changing, and I think in a very positive direction. A number of you are aware of and have used the essential learning outcomes of AAC&U. And one of the questions that sometimes is asked is, how are these related? Are they somehow, do you choose between them? Are they competitive? And I want to show that relationship very quickly. And then looking at actual on-the-ground uses of DQP and tuning over the last 4 to 5 years. And just a small number of examples to give you there, and an invitation for you to add to that discussion by talking about some uses that you might be aware of. So the issue of kind of what's going on right now, I draw a lot of this from the research that's maintained by the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment, NILOA, which is, as you may know, headquartered at University of Illinois. And then that's not really the last bullet. It should be kind of the overarching bullet. What are your questions? At the end, yes, but not just at the end, as we go along, please, at any time. So these are our learning outcomes, and at the very end of our hour, in about 65 minutes, we will review those and decide whether we've been spending this time productively or not. So to begin with some good news, I think there are two important areas, two important statements about what a strong liberal education at all levels for all students embodies. And we also have, the secret of the first bullet is that I'm talking about the essential learning outcomes. And the bullet number 2 is that we have a statement about the learning outcomes that are consistent with the award of the 3 essential degrees. And the essential learning outcomes are, in a way, kind of the godfather of this discussion, because 2 of the people involved in the degree qualifications profile, Carol Schneider, president of AAC&U, and myself, were involved in the creation of the essential learning outcomes. But along around 2009, 2010, it was recognized that the essential learning outcomes, as powerful as they are, as useful as they are, do not define what the associate degree or any other degree means in terms of demonstrable student performance. Nor do they offer an invitation for assessment. And so again, 2 of the 4 authors of the DQP took on that task in part because of a sense that there was more work that needed to be done. And that is the premise behind the degree qualifications profile. What you see at the top left is the beta version that was issued in January of 2011. And what you see at the lower right hand is the not beta version, the DQP that was issued last October in Indianapolis. And even that is not considered kind of the last story, because one of the experiences of the foundation in terms of working with the DQP is that there's a lot to be learned from you and from your experience. And if you compare these two, as I will a little bit later, just to suggest to you some of the differences very briefly, you'll see that most of those differences reflect what came in as a result of people using the DQP, saying, why doesn't it have this? Why doesn't it have that? Be a lot more helpful to us if it did the following. And so there is that attempt to be responsive. So they're both really, in a sense, about the same question. That's really the question. And that may be the most important question before the House, because you can have all of the goals you like. President Obama's goal about post-secondary credentials, or Lumina's endorsement of that goal in its big goal that there will be 60% of the population with post-secondary credentials by 2025. That's the big goal. That's the question that needs to be asked to make those goals meaningful. Because you can print diplomas and you can satisfy those numbers, but unless you define what those credentials mean in terms of their quality, where does that get you? And so that's the question. And the way the question's asked, a little bit different. That really is the question for the essential learning outcomes, the liberal learning objectives that are the broad requisites, the kind of lodestars out there for effective degree programs. And again, not for privileged students at private colleges, but for all students engaged in higher education in America. And the DQP asks that question in this way, about the learning that degree recipients should be able to demonstrate, and how. Because when we suggest that someone who is computationally literate should have certain capacities, certain abilities, we think it's important to go the next step and say, by doing at least some of the following, which then gives the toehold for assessment. And then the tools. There are tools for both. The value rubrics for the essential learning outcomes that Terry Rhodes and his colleagues at ACNU have developed, and maybe some of you have found useful. And NALOA maintaining an assignments library, which I urge you to check out if you haven't already, that really draws on the best experience of faculty who are using the DQP and the essential learning outcomes, and framing assignments in their courses so that students can demonstrate the learning that they are accomplishing. Behind much of what we're talking about this morning are 3 very simple assumptions. And again, please take issue with any of these or add to them if you wish. But this seems to me assumption number 1, and that's not going to strike anyone as particularly startling. In fact, that's been identified as the oldest pedagogical principle that we have. It goes all the way back to Plato, that if you enable a student to learn what's going to be expected, the student is going to be more focused, more committed, is going to be better motivated, and is going to learn more than, well, you're taking Sociology 201 on a Tuesday morning. You know why you're here. We know why you're here, right? I was conducting a series of 3 workshops last spring at, I will simply say, a major Midwestern university, not my own, not any that you've heard of, I'm sure, or that you have any friends at. But at any rate, 3 workshops on learning outcomes and general education reform. They took place in the Student Center, and there were posters in the Student Center guiding faculty members into these workshops. Right in the middle of the second one, 2 students walked in, and I still think back with admiration on what it must have taken for them to open those doors and walk in and said, "You all are talking about general education, right? Well, pardon us for interrupting, but we've just come from our X class, and we took a little poll among our fellow students, and we said, anybody know why we're here? What we're learning, why we're supposed to be learning this?" And we didn't have a clue. And so we saw these signs, and we thought, maybe you should know that. That, you know, we'd like to know. We'd like you to tell us what the secret is. And so, if we want students to appreciate the values of a general education and the values of pre-professional education, the values of any kind of education, letting them in on the secret can be a good idea. This seems to me a related assumption, that the curricula that we frame can be far more purposeful, far more intentional, if there is a clear sense of what the college's learning goals are, what that associate degree should signify, regardless of discipline, regardless of the particular program of preparation. What does the associate degree mean when we hand that to a student? And then finally, and these days this is not a kind of afterthought, because part of what we need to do is tell our story more effectively. And we can tell that story more effectively if we can talk about what we're accomplishing in ways that people can understand and appreciate. In North Dakota, about 4 years ago, North Dakota State was planning to hold a meeting of North Dakota educators, community colleges, University of North Dakota Sciences College, and they were interested in the DQP. They wondered whether the DQP might be something that they could all kind of get together on. But they took a preliminary step. Before the conference convened, before they even sent out copies to the participants, they went to their panel of employers, and they shared the DQP with the employers, and they said, is this language that you find meaningful and resonant? Does this describe what you're looking for in a graduate of one of our institutions? And it was only when the employers came back and said, for the most part, yes, that they were willing then to go out to the educational institutions, the faculty members, the administrators. Because this telling of our story isn't just to maintain the level of support that we need, although it is important in that respect, but it's also part of our responsibility to make clear to those who are employing our graduates what we're preparing them for, what kind of strengths and capacities they'll have when they show up. And this is the correlation, that proving, as your conference slogan suggests, is important, but improvement is the goal. The reason that I'm here, I think, is because of the assumption that in terms of meeting these goals, proving and improving, the DQP and the tuning process can be helpful. So I'd just like to get a sense of the room. Who would consider themselves deeply acquainted with the DQP and or tuning? Could I see a show of hands? Deep acquaintance with? 2. So generously 5%, okay. That actually is reassuring, because I did prepare a few slides that suggest that maybe a quick refresher would be of some help. And that was one of our learning objectives, after all, to make sure that everyone is up to speed. So this is the quick refresher in terms of the DQP and tuning. And to begin with DQP, I understand that there's already someone in this room who long ago developed the mnemonic of the Dairy Queen parfait. That is certainly one possibility. This all comes out of Lumina Foundation in Indiana, where Dan Quayle developed a particular spelling for the potato. So this is the Dan Quayle potato with the E on the end. And this drawn from the headlines of recent days. This is the daily quorum protocol in the House. But then to look and deconstruct the acronym just for a moment. Why degree? Because the emphasis is about the degree, associate, bachelor's, master's, regardless of discipline. Doesn't mean that there is not a discipline, because that's one of the expectations of the DQP, that there be extensive education in and competence proficiency in a particular discipline, but it means that overall the student who receives the degree ought to have these proficiencies. And then the focus on qualifications, so that the DQP is organized according to the domains of learning that enable students to demonstrate the proficiencies that we expect them to develop. And profile, because it's not trying to impose particular statements of outcomes on anyone. It's supposed to be offering a point of departure, that your outcomes should look something like this. They should be as concrete, as specific, as accessible, as demonstrable as the ones that we are demonstrating. 3 years ago at the board retreat of the board of the Higher Learning Commission, which is you're in SACS, right? Southern Association. So what used to be the North Central Association is now the Higher Learning Commission. So their board meeting, they invited 2 institutions that were using the DQP. One was New Mexico Junior College. The other was the University of Chicago. And one of the revelations as they sat together on that panel was how much, in many respects, they had in common, and how they were approaching challenges in many of the same ways. And the University of Chicago was not by any means going to adopt the DQP. But using the DQP, they discovered that their statements of learning outcomes weren't nearly as concrete as they might be, and that there were areas that they needed to cover that they weren't covered. New Mexico Junior College found the DQP a means really of redirecting, reorienting the institution as a whole. And both were compelling stories, and both had a kind of synergy among them, but no attempt to standardize outcomes, and that's the pushback that you sometimes hear. And when I'm asked, aren't you really trying to standardize? My response is that there are a lot of people out there who would love to standardize our responses. I just read this morning's Chronicle that former Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings is apparently in line to become the president of the University of North Carolina. She was one who 6-7 years ago would have been very happy to standardize outcomes for us. Our best defense against standardization is to work towards a collegial consensus on some standards, and that's what the DQP is trying to do. So some assumptions behind the profile. I'll run through these fairly quickly because you can see this yourself by actually looking at the profile. The effort is to be specific, explicit, concrete, that there is a ratcheting up. The idea is that a bachelor's degree should be more than a doubled associate degree. And a master's degree should be more than a bachelor's degree on steroids. There should be a kind of difference in kind there as well. And there's the assumption that these outcomes, that there is no cut and dried way of accomplishing them. There is no specific path laid out. The idea is students can reach these outcomes by multiple paths. And maybe the more multiple, the better, because there is this important commitment to appreciating, valuing, and helping to protect the diversity of American higher education. And then finally, there's the recognition that no expression of consensus is going to be able to cover all that there is out there. And so these are offered as illustrations, not as intended to be comprehensive. So even more quickly now, 5 areas of learning. You can see these if you get a copy, and you can, if you don't have a copy, you can write to Lumina Foundation and they'll send it to you quickly, free shipping and handling and all of that. These 5 areas of learning, the two that kind of struck people as perhaps a little bit more interesting and unusual in the early going, one was the idea of the intellectual skills, being very clear about computation and writing and communication and the like, and doing so in ways that were meaningful. And the other was applied learning. Carol Schneider believes, and I think many of you would agree, that this distinction between applied and kind of abstract learning is really long overdue for the trash heap. The best kind of liberal learning about literature, learning about ethics, learning about history, that ought to be applied learning, in the same sense that the best kind of education about employable skills, such as accounting or nursing, these also have to have a kind of liberalizing value to them as well. And so applied learning as a clearly established and clearly stated value. Civic learning, the recognition that education is about more than just qualifying people for an entry-level position. It really is about securing the future of the nation. It is about what Thomas Jefferson called the public happiness. By the education that we provide, we enable our society to become stronger. At least that is the hope. An important assumption of the degree qualifications profile is that these aren't silos. There's a lot of permeability. There needs to be. And there needs to be a sense that anyone who is teaching anything is, in a sense, teaching all of these. And if that isn't the case, it needs to be. I've been now talking for quite a while without any hands going up, any questions being asked, any objections being raised. What's out there? What are you thinking about? What are you, in the back of your mind, wanting to push back about a little bit? This would be a great time to just take a kind of sample of what the thinking is at the moment. Any questions about these areas? Does this make sense to you, or questions about their relation? Yes, please.
I guess I'm looking toward the future, and is there any vision of eventually putting the doctoral level within the GQP as well?
There is. And in fact, there's now a commitment on the part of Lumina Foundation to do just that, beginning with the professional doctorate. The doctorates that at one time were master's degrees, pharmacy, physical therapy, audiology, because that is a source of remarkable confusion to the public and even among some of those professions. And so that's kind of going to be the first objective. And I met just last month with the Association of Specialized and Professional Accreditors, which has most of those disciplines within it, and probably a group from that organization and some others will be working on that. Lumina is also working with the Council on Graduate Schools, the CGS, in terms of the PhD, which I think is going to be a little more difficult as an issue, but this was part of the feedback that came through in the use of the beta version, that really the job is not yet done until you pay attention to the doctorate and until you pay attention to certificates. And both of these areas of work are underway. So thank you for that question. Are there other questions? And again, yes, sir.
So I'm sitting here struck by the recent study done by skills employers want. We hear a lot about the skills that employers want.
Yes.
And your very first slide on the generally agreed upon outcomes of a liberal arts education.
Yes.
And I don't know if there's a whole lot of general agreement right now between the academy and our employers. And so I guess the question that I would have for you, that juxtaposed against the new state of Texas requirement in the 30 by 60 by Texas plan, requiring every academic degree program to codify and state its intended outcomes for their specific degree. And it just forces me really to think about the broader question of how do we close the gap between what we want to teach and want students to learn in the academy, and yet what the marketplace is asking and demanding in terms of employability.
Thank you. Could everyone hear that? Great. I don't know about the Texas standards, but I do know about the study. And that study is done every couple of years. And it has shown over the years a much greater alignment than it used to show in terms of the expectations of employers and the aspirations of higher education. And you know, I encourage you can in fact read the results of that study on the AAC&U website, because what it suggests is that while employers continue to value highly the substantive education for particular job classifications, they have increasingly come to value the kinds of skills and abilities that are consistent with a marketplace that is changing, that is dynamic, that is evolving. And in particular, priorities that they are saying are increasingly important are adaptability, the ability to to work in teams. Above all, the ability to learn new stuff, to be an adept learner, an adept and independent learner. John Pepper, who used to be the president of Procter & Gamble, had a wonderful way of putting this to college students. He would say, these were college students who'd been drawn to hear him by thought of maybe I'll go to work for Procter & Gamble. He would say, we don't want you educated for a job at Procter & Gamble. And, you know, people would think, well, why did I come? Then after a pause, he would say, we want you educated for a promotion at Procter & Gamble. And then he would talk about what that means in terms of managerial ability and leadership and communication and the like. The other, yes, please.
I'm listening to the conversation, and I might have missed it. Some of this could be covered in competency-based learning. I don't know if this is on. As you know, we learned about that at a different conference, but competency-based learning, when those students are learning those skills that, you know, the employers want, but we're still covering what we need to cover in the classroom. And because I work with a lot of the youth outside of TCC, and they have bachelor's degrees, but I ask them to email me, and they struggle. And that just shouldn't be when they get to a certain level. So there's certain things that I can see employers needing to have that we can still teach them and still be able to cover our content and assess that at the same time. I think it takes some work, it takes some collaboration, but I think it can happen to get what we all need.
Thank you. Beautifully said. I mean, the response of the authors of the DQP would be that all learning should be competency-based learning. And that when we speak of competency-based learning these days, in terms of, you know, direct assessment in a progressively kind of narrow sense, that's really to misuse the phrase, that we're not trying to reduce to narrow education, to limit our students by the narrowness, but the idea of competency-based, that's the essential premise. That was Plato's essential premise, and should be ours. So. Please, let me, yes, you could grab that one, and there's a little switch at the bottom that you need to slide up till you see the green light.
We can take care of passing around as people walk, that way you won't have to.
Okay. Well, I kind of like visiting people.
You want it back? You can have it.
And I kind of want to push back on, I guess, the first assumption, the idea that students are more motivated or highly motivated when they know what is expected of them. I think, and particularly the conversations I've had with faculty members and some students, they want a credential. So, and a lot of them are want the credential to address the lower needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right.
And so therefore, a lot of the more you tell them, you make it explicit what's expected of them, actually the more overwhelmed and less motivated they are, because they are interested in the end result, not the journey to the end result. And making that journey explicit does not increase motivation, it decreases motivation. So I think the assumption is applicable and appropriate for maybe, I don't know, maybe a lot of the students. I think we miss a significant population that may have been either underserved or underrepresented in higher education. I know at the DCCD, our chancellor used the term non-consumers, so people who haven't been a part of post-secondary education.
So, before you put the microphone back, how would you respond to those students in a way that would enable them to become more motivated, to become owners of their education, to understand?
I'm attempted to do this in a couple of research projects, not with adult learners, but more with K-12 or or even beginning or seniors in high school, with a thought of, a lot of times they don't realize that what is required of them in education they're doing already in some other setting.
Okay.
I had and this is anecdotal conversation with a nephew. Conversation with a nephew who was really struggling with science and math and problem solving and critical thinking. And so we had a conversation about a video game that he loved. And my question to him was, when was the last time you read the manual? And he didn't. He knew the problem, he knew the resources available to him, and he explored and trial and error, figured out what to do. And I explained to him that that's basically a science project. So
Yep.
but him being his age or his experience couldn't see how to transfer that to education. So I think for some of our population, someone will have to help them realize that what's being required of them in education is not just post-secondary higher education. Because we do have a tendency to put our experiences in a box, and it's very contextual,
Right.
self-efficacy or our confidence. And hey, somebody, be it an academic support, be it academic support units or student support units, somebody will have to help them to see that you have the experience and the knowledge that will transfer. And if they don't get that experience, then in class, as things become more explicit, then the more defeated they will become.
No, it's a great example, and you did some wonderful teaching there with your nephew.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful teaching. I would say that at least one assumption behind the DQP corresponds exactly with your premise that what students are interested in, what they're going for, is that credential. But what it's trying to say to them is that this credential needs to be meaningful. It needs to correspond. It needs to prepare you for more than that entry-level job. I mean, I think one of our obligations as educators is to take the aspirations of our students and enlarge them, or enable them to become enlarged. But knowing where to begin, your point is exactly right, so that we work with our students where they are, not where we might necessarily want them to be. And so thank you very much. Other feedback at this point? Well, let me move on just to, we've talked about this. I was trying to cycle back to the that statement about expectations of students, but I think it's also important to understand what the profile has no intent of doing. And, you know, the first of the lot is standardized degrees. No. In fact, the effort is to protect the differentiation among degrees, that in a very real sense, your associate degree ought to embody certain values, certain principles, certain assumptions that may be distinct to you, in addition to all of the things that you share. The first college that invited me to consult with them about the DQP after the issuing of the DQP was a Midwestern college whose primary claim to fame is its strong commitment to evangelism. And I was perplexed. I thought, well, you know, I certainly want this to be a useful tool, but I just wonder about this institution, given its emphasis. Why is it kind of first in line to talk about the DQP? And what they said to me when I visited them, and I visited them twice, was, we offer a fundamentally sound liberal arts education, in addition to which we envision that education within this larger context of Christian belief. But we need a way to say how committed we are to the essential values of a liberal arts education, and the DQP enables us to do that. So they weren't going to in any way become less distinctive or less committed, but they were going to be able to tell at least part of their story more effectively. Not intended to define what should be taught. Again, that idea of many paths to the same goal. This is, in some sense, true. In one sense, it isn't true. What is the beep? Is it coming from me? Oh, okay. I was afraid I was beeping. There is an assumption in the DQP, and there's an assumption in much of what we are doing on the ground, that you can't just stand behind a lectern and lecture and assume that the students are learning and then expect them to demonstrate that learning. So there is at least maybe a little bit of an implication here that the commitment in the classroom has to be to active and accessible learning. I've been back in the classroom for 8 years now, after 25 years as an administrator, including serving as the provost at Kent State for 8 years. And my students had just discovered this, and they said, "You were once the provost." And I said, "Guilty as charged, still recovering, but," and they said, "Well, what was that like?" And I said, "Oh, it was in many ways a very good thing. I felt like I was able to do." "Well, was there anything you really wanted to do that you didn't get accomplished?" And I said, well, it's a serious question, deserves a serious answer. And I said, yes, I really had envisioned at one point building in all the classroom buildings a trap door behind every lectern. And if any faculty member stood behind that lectern for more than 15 minutes, the trap door would open, and by a kind of pneumatic chute, the faculty member would be delivered to the Faculty Professional Development Center. So they laughed about that, and they said, well, why couldn't you do it? And I said, well, like anything else, it was a matter of cost. And there was this kind of pause, and one of my students said, "You should have taken up a collection among the students." I thought, okay. So there is at least that little bit of pedagogical implication. No intent to encourage rankings internally or externally, but rather to be able to enable a program or an institution to talk about what it does well in ways that make sense. So tuning, maybe for some of you the less well-known partner here, and it is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a European term. There's the tuning fork. Orchestras tune, as musicians among you know, to the oboe, which has this capacity to hit a perfect A 440, and then the violinist, the concert master, picks up the note, and the orchestra tunes to the note. That's really the idea behind tuning, that a university, a college, is a little bit like an orchestra with many different disciplines, each kind of playing its own tune. But the idea about tuning is to bring a degree of harmony so that people aren't working on different pitches and creating dissonance. Now, related to that, just essentially says what I just said. And I think I may be actually missing a couple of slides here. Maybe they do come along a little later, but the idea is that, in fact, I think they do. The idea is that tuning and the DQP are very closely related in ways that you'll see in a moment. So recent developments, I mentioned a little while ago the release of the DQP, kind of the formal release following the trial use, and the commitment to merge these two as alternate strategies for developing these outcomes. they used to be different. The reasons for the DQP second edition, really just listening to feedback and embedding that feedback in ways that are, I hope, to be helpful to people. Sorry I'm giving you so much exercise there. So, as you look at the new DQP, I think you can do so with some confidence that there is no intent here to do radical revision. The longer answer is that if you've been working with the DQP, even with the beta version, you don't really need to switch. You can if you like, but there aren't substantive differences in structure or contents. There are, I think, enhancements that are responsive to the advice we received. And here are a few of the changes. One of the big areas of pushback had to do with what was called ethics. There's nothing in here about ethics. And the reason there wasn't is that, at least in the first go-around, the authors could not find a way to grapple with how do you express expectations of ethical development in terms that can be assessed, terms that can be demonstrated. Well, 4 years' time, listening to a lot of advice, and actually becoming better informed, showed us that there are ways in which you can test for growth in ethical reasoning. As just one example, ethical reasoning can be measured in part by the ability of an individual to argue persuasively for a position with which that individual disagrees. In other words, a person who is developing a kind of ethical skill, an ethical capacity, is someone who is determinedly right to life, but who can at least understand and articulate a position from the perspective of someone who is pro-choice, or someone who is, Bernie Sanders is able to get up and talk meaningfully and informatively about the Tea Party. Those kinds of things are associated with, correlated with ethical reasoning, and so now that's part of the DQP. Global learning is a greater emphasis. The quantitative reasoning statements have been strengthened and are, I think, now more easily assessed. And there is, at the end, a lexicon of the terms used. Why do we use proficiency rather than competence, for instance? You can read about that in the lexicon, the word list for the DQP. There's also this sense that students at all educational levels need the experience of meaningful assignments, signature assignments, assignments that enable them to work independently and creatively, regardless of whether they're pursuing an associate, a bachelor's, or a master's degree. Understanding that there are approaches to learning that aren't bound within particular disciplines, that necessarily enable students to transfer their skills from one discipline to another, or from one job to another. And understanding that intellectual skills have a direct bearing on specialized skills, applied skills, and civic learning. That you learn more about computational literacy, to take one kind of wild example, if you hear it from your English professor about the growth of the railroads during the 19th century and the effect that had on romantic poetry. I mean, one of the premises of the DQP is that whatever you're teaching, you should be teaching computation. Whatever you're teaching, you should be teaching communication. Whatever you're teaching, you should be teaching maybe even history. And then finally, and this was one of the questions earlier, these are some of the a recognition that this is work that still is to be done in terms of creating a DQP that is inclusive, never comprehensive, remember, but at least inclusive of all of the certificates and other credentials. Also, it tries to be more user-friendly. There are some resources that the DQP will now point users to in terms of applying this, how you can make use of it in your context, and the lexicon, which I mentioned, and the resemblances between the DQP and the tuning process, as well as a kind of Q&A there at the end, frequently asked questions, and the responses that we think are appropriate. There's some examples. There's also a reference to the NALOA website where you can go and read about lots of different programs and institutions using the DQP and tuning. So, yeah, these were the slides I was afraid that I had forgotten, but they're here. And at one time, these were seen as kind of discrete operations. Tuning actually began in 2009. Lumina sponsored tuning projects in 3 states to begin with, Indiana and Minnesota and Utah. And the idea was that in particular disciplines, faculty members from different institutions would come together to define the learning outcomes that students in those fields should be developing at progressive stages throughout the degree program. And so they were, in a sense, tuning graphic design in Minnesota, regardless of whether you went to University of Minnesota or to one of the regional Minnesota universities. And that has now grown to 10 states which have active tuning projects underway. And then the DQP was running along in its parallel track, talking about institutional outcomes as a way of creating an umbrella for the development of disciplinary outcomes. And so what was recognized was that you're really talking about the same thing. You're talking about beginning with the disciplines and kind of building up and then saying, what are the implications here for institutional outcomes? Or beginning the other way and saying, institutional outcomes, okay, well then, what do the disciplines need to do in order to accomplish those? So now these are seen as very much on the same track, part of the same train. And so I'll just let you glance at this. Is pretty much what I was just saying. The DQP we've talked about, the tuning we've talked about that begins with the disciplines. And the recognition now is that you really need both. You really need to approach this problem in 2 directions. From the sense that there needs to be a statement of institutional outcomes to which the disciplinary outcomes are aligned. But there is also a sense in which the institutional outcomes should express the strengths and distinctiveness of the disciplinary outcomes. And one of the sources of this enlightenment was a project undertaken by the National Communications Association, which did an experiment. A number of institutions in the study determined, agreed, committed to implementing the DQP. Another third of the institutions said, we're going to begin with tuning, working towards disciplinary outcomes. The third cohort, the other third, said, we're going to do both at the same time. And what NCA discovered was, that's the best way to go. That's the most effective way. That's a way of getting everyone on board, understanding, participating together, and it's a powerful model. So as you see the DQP, this is Peter Ewell's formulation, a product that implies a process. Tuning describes a process that implies a product. And really, it takes 2, as Marvin said. It really depends on the nature of the institution, kind of which you undertake first, or whether you undertake them both at exactly the same time. But we've seen colleges that say, for us it makes more sense to work beginning at the disciplinary level, especially when we can get our faculty out talking to their colleagues in our other colleges and universities. But others say, no, we really want to have the statement of institutional outcomes at the top so that our colleges and programs kind of know what they're expected to direct their programs to. Often, those that want to do tuning first are the smaller colleges, community colleges, liberal arts colleges. Large research institutions are generally finding that sometimes it makes more sense to begin at that global level and then ask the disciplines to respond. Prompts for tuning include these 7 bullets. I'll let you glance at them quickly. This last bullet is one of the, I think, the more interesting elements of tuning that ought not to be lost when we're working within institutions, and that's the idea that colleagues in a discipline work with colleagues from other disciplines. And that's a powerful idea. It's happening in communications, it's happening in history. American Historical Association has a 3-year project in this regard that is really doing great things. Mathematics in Utah. I've got some examples in just a minute. And then those also, I could have just used one slide for both because these are also prompts for the DQP. Every one of them is a prompt for the DQP. So 3 principles behind them. Again, by now, nothing that I'm going to say is going to strike you as particularly fresh or original, because these are, in a sense, kind of the bedrock of all that we've been talking about this morning. We need to tell our story more effectively because there are people out there who want to tell it for us or to tell us what to do. The number of credentials doesn't mean anything unless we guarantee their quality, and tuning in the DQP should address these concerns in ways that are useful. And the corollary of that is, as we address those concerns in useful ways, we need to do so in terms that are understandable to our various publics, our stakeholders. NALOA is doing good work in keeping track of what's going on, and again, I encourage you to look at that website. You're all engaged with assessment. I mean, this is the clearinghouse of what's going on in terms of assessment, and with a little tiny staff there in Champaign-Urbana, I think they do a marvelous job. So here are just a few examples drawn from NALOA that you could find yourself, but some institutions that say, we don't want anybody else's bloody outcomes telling us what to do, are nevertheless saying, but the DQP does give us, this is, again, University of Chicago, among others, does give us a chance to maybe see if there are any gaps. I mentioned this just a moment ago, history and communications, working to create discipline-wide statements that, you know, a person who gets a bachelor's degree in communication should have these capacities, these competencies, these proficiencies, whether they earn that degree at Southern Utah or at Harvard. And I mentioned this as well, because Peter Ewell would say, if you can't assess it, we don't say it. And that's the standard for the outcome statements. I mentioned a couple of these, And there are more now that are underway. I've been to College Station twice in the last 2 years, working with the colleges of business, the use of the DQP in terms of, within that system, developing shared expectations for their degree programs in business. And this isn't by any means a complete list. The list is a lot longer than this. Those are just a few interesting examples. One other interesting about, one reason why I like to mention graphic design, Minnesota. Minnesota is a state that has kind of the University of Minnesota and everything else. And one of the lessons of tuning for them was that there were some really cool things going on out there in graphic design programs out in the state that had never made their way to the University of Minnesota. And so you had learning going on among colleagues that transcended the usual sense of hierarchy. Very healthy phenomenon. Use of the profile as a kind of sense of where I am in terms of my work towards a degree. Am I accomplishing all that I want to be? Is there a way in which I can figure out why I'm taking this sociology course on a Tuesday morning here at the University of Major Midwest? And so, as we were saying, tuning can be a route towards institutional outcomes. It can enable us, when students say to us, well, you know, I'm pretty satisfied with the associate degree program I'm enrolled in. I think it's going to do for me what I want. But just tell me, why should I even be interested in a bachelor's degree? Well, the DQP could help you tell that story, and it might not change the student's mind. In fact, it might confirm the student in his sense that this is really where I need to be at this point in my life. But it at least gives information in terms of trying to define the difference between study at the bachelor's and the associate degree level, so that the decision is more fully informed. Not about persuading necessarily, but just about providing information. And then employers and graduate programs, here's what I accomplished, here's what I believe I accomplished, because I went to an institution that commits to these learning outcomes as expressed in the DQP or as modeled on the DQP, and I accomplished those, and I'm ready to hit the ground running at your institution or your corporation. Accreditation results, and accreditation is the, we have about 5 more minutes. Accreditation is the major arena in which I'm working right now because of a book that I published about 18 months ago on why higher education accreditation needs to change. Scary when people begin to take your recommendations seriously. And one of the issues is that the public really doesn't understand accreditation. We need to enable the public to understand accreditation, and the DQP tuning can enable us to do that. In the Higher Learning Commission, that's a lot of what's going on. 10 to infinity would be how you might use the DQP and tuning. And so this is a story that is still being written, and it's a story that you will help to write. So this is, again, we don't have much more time, but is there anyone out there who might be able to give me an example that I could use in the next such presentation of ways in which you have found the DQP or tuning to be useful? Yes, please.
With student outcomes in mind, I'm curious as to, in the measurements, is time involved, timing? In other words, are the students allowed a certain amount of time to achieve a degree?
The simple answer would be no. That is the recognition in the DQP that when I say there are many paths, I would say there are paths of many lengths. And for some, that path to those proficiencies leads through the military, or it leads through job experience, or it leads through higher education at different rates. And the question for the DQP is not how long did the student take, but where is the student now? And if that student can demonstrate proficiency, it is, as we say these days, agnostic about the path or the length of the path.
That's encouraging. I'm glad.
Yeah, and there is a statement to that effect somewhere in the DQP. Other questions? Yes, or comments? Yes.
Regarding the rise of dual credit in early college high schools,
Right.
and the roles that K through 12 would play in preparing students or having them college ready, I didn't really see any slides that kind of brought that up, but like, would there be any expectations? Because we make assumptions that students have skills when they come to us to get their associates, but that's not necessarily the case, and they spend a lot of time in remediation and development courses to be college ready.
And that's right. And again, I think it points to the issue of a variety of paths. For some students, that path is going to be through advanced placement. They're on the fast track. They come to college with the first year essentially out of the way, complete, and they move to that associate degree in a year's time or whatever. And again, the DQP says the question for us is, have the proficiencies been accomplished? But there is a more complicated answer, and for that I would direct you to a white paper that I did about a year ago for Lumina, aligning the Common Core state standards with the degree qualifications profile, because there is a close alignment there in the areas of written and oral expression on the one hand and mathematics on the other. And so it does become a more complicated issue, but in the simplest possible of terms is, again, different students, different strokes. So these were the learning outcomes about an hour and 10 minutes ago. I think we've talked at least about these. I hope it hasn't just been a matter of my teaching. I hope it's also been a matter of your learning. I come from the home of Sherwin-Williams paints, of course, so coverage is, sometimes seen as important, but it's not really the importance. We've talked about the relationship, we've talked about how they're being used and what's going on, and we have about 3 minutes for your questions, or your observations, reservations, or dark suspicions, or even a brief aria. Aretha's just promised to sing us a question in a kind of karaoke style at some point. You're not backing away from this. I won't embarrass Aretha. I think I may have. Anyway, questions, observations, dark suspicions? I was asked, yes, please, in the back. We have the mic on its way.
I believe you mentioned that the QDP was summative in nature.
Yes.
And there are a lot of folks, including Peter Ewell, who advocate for formative evaluation as well. Can you tell us how that might fit in and how we might persuade folks to do that as well as summative, since there's a lot of pushback even doing the summative one?
Yeah, and again, I would That's an issue that I take up at some length in the book on accreditation. And one of the things I think that accreditors have learned, and you see that in the design of the new programs that they're rolling out, is that both are critically important, but there's a danger in conflating them and getting them confused with one another. Principle that comes to us right out of corporate HR, where they discovered that if you try to talk with an employee about, what's going to be your raise for next year, and then let's create a professional development plan, you're not going to be able to communicate with equal effectiveness on both. Peter Ewell, author of the DQP, I would, I shouldn't speak for him, but I often do, and he for me, I think would say that in terms of the summative assumptions of the DQP, there's a strong implication that the whole impetus behind that is on formative assessment. That is to say, if you're doing this well, if you are measuring student accomplishment in a way that is genuinely useful, then you understand that there will be some areas in which your accomplishments, your students' accomplishments will not be all that you had hoped that they would be, which redirects attention back. I mean, there is that cycle of assessment that Peter likes to use, and he says that there's often that missing link between the publication of clear assessment outcomes and the use of those outcomes to create program improvements. That's the link that is often missing and needs to be there. So I'd say they're both on that wagon wheel. Okay, we have time for about one more question according to the clock on the wall. One more observation. Yes, please.
You mentioned earlier the National Communication Association work, and I was part of that team.
Oh, bravo.
And to get back to what you were just talking about, I really think that that's where tuning sort of kicks in too. You talked about them being sort of on parallel tracks and then showing them together, and boy, that's really how they should be thought of.
Thank you.
So when I think about the DQP being summative, I think about tuning being formative and sort of getting us then to that end level. And they really do hold hands, at the risk of oversimplifying the two ideas. They just work together so nicely to create this final product, hopefully, that ends in students being proficient in a variety of things.
Thank you so much. Well, I want to thank you for my introduction, and I will just tell one other quick story about another kind of introduction that I received not long ago when I was giving a talk at an institution in Quebec. And it was interesting in many ways, but the introduction was one in which the person introducing me told this little story, which seems appropriate in the light of kind of what's going on these days in our political campaigns on both sides of the aisle. And he told the story about God calling in Abraham one day to say, I'd just like to kind of show you about this creation that I've made, and I'd like to draw your attention in particular, if you would just look particularly with me at Canada. I'm proud of Canada. Look at the pristine forests, the polite cab drivers, the wholesome food, the wonderful vineyards, the fact that they run a campaign for prime minister in 6 weeks max. And Abraham finally has enough of this and says, well, God, it seems to me you're playing favorites. I mean, all of these blessings on Canada, and you didn't even mention the healthcare system. God says, no, it all evens out. Wait until I show you who I've given them for neighbors. It's good to be your neighbors, and thank you all very much.